So, welcome viewers to this new episode of Beyond Phrenology. We are delighted to have with us today Professor Edward Large from University of Connecticut. He's the
Hi,
leading
Madhur.
expert. Pardon?
I said hi.
Yeah. So, Professor Large is a leading expert in auditory neuroscience. He's also the director of Music Dynamics Laboratory, and he is interested in exploring music, neuroscience, and nonlinear dynamical systems. Especially, so nonlinear dynamical systems is the framework which he uses to understand the neurosciences music. Basically to identify the hidden rhythms that shape how we perceive and respond to sound and how it affects our health and it can improve our health. He has been there since 2013. Before that, he was at Florida Atlantic University and was a postdoc at UPenn. Interestingly, he is the founder of a company called Oscillo Biosciences. This company is developing therapeutics for the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer. Uh, we had a similar podcast with Professor Bernard Body before, and I think learn a lot more in the second podcast related to music today. So, welcome, Professor Lars, to Beyond Phrenology.
Hi, thanks. Good to see you again.
Yeah, it's pleasure, Professor Lars. So, Professor Lars, would uh, walk us through a little bit about your career trajectory? You are one of the pioneers in this field, and there are not many people, studying music from that scientific standpoint, especially related to diseases. So a little bit about your background, especially, your expertise in music. I guess you are a good musician as well, and how that all relates to, the science you do currently in your lab.
Right, right. So thanks. Yeah, I mean, hard to say exactly where to start there, but so yes, I am a musician. I actually, I've been playing music since I was, 11 or 12 years old, maybe younger. Um, in college, I started studying math, and then I decided to transfer to study classical guitar performance. So I became very interested in music and was also very interested in music theory. And after a few years after college, after doing some performing and working in various different kinds of jobs, I decided to return to graduate school. And at the time, I wanted to study computer science. I was really interested in artificial intelligence and cognitive science and neural networks and those kind of things. And I really thought, neural networks, were really promising for the study of music. And but when I got to graduate school, I realized there were a whole group of people out there in the world who are studying music from a scientific point of view, and that I hadn't really known before. And in those days, it was a very small field. I mean, you say the field is small, and I suppose it is. It's huge compared to when I was in it. I remember going to my first conference of the Society for Music Perception Cognition um, at UPenn, I think in 1993, and I think there were about 50 people there. And it was, I think, pretty literally everyone in the world who was doing music cognition full time at the time, you know. So yeah, so I've been doing this really since I kind of got in on the ground floor, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely, a kind of early mover advantage you had, as well as uh, a lot more you can do in a niche field as well.
That's right. That's right. Now it's hard for me to even, keep up with all the literature. There's so much going on in our field.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So what are the core questions which were important or people were trying to answer when you joined the field, and how have they evolved now? So what kind of questions currently people are interested in?
So yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, at the beginning, I think people were really very interested in the very basic questions. How do we perceive rhythm? How do we perceive pitch? How do we perceive tonality in music, which is, a way in which music is structured. For example, a melody where there's some tones sound more stable than others, and some tones are attracted to others. And those were the kinds of questions that really fascinated me. And I think those are still really very deep questions and very, as we move towards answering those questions, we're going to learn a lot about the human brain. But just in terms of how things have evolved, we went from basic questions in perception and cognition to basic questions in neuroscience. Where is the perception of pitch happening in the brain? Those kind of questions. And to now, where we're at a point where the field is mature enough that there are, commercially, viable, music-based interventions that we can develop to really help people who suffer from neurodegenerative disorders, from psychological disorders, emotional issues, and so forth. Yeah.
Music has been historically used to relief, right? From pain, from misery, from, a number of things. You see Titanic sinking, and then you see, people playing a violin and, the whole
Uh-huh.
orchestra, playing its tune.
It's a good
S-
example.
right?
Yeah.
So there's something, very profound about music. But what is it about music? Like, how is it different than prose or, listening to, someone speaking? Like, what exactly it is about, in music that it resonates so deeply with our emotions or with our affective side of physiology.
Well, I mean, I think there's so many questions buried in that one question. I hope we can unpack that question as we go.
Yeah.
Um, but you started out with how is music different from prose, for example, and I think um, from my point of view, from the approach that I've taken, um, music really touches the brain in a very deep way. It it exploits, if I can use that word, really the fundamental dynamics of intrinsic neural mechanisms in a way that I don't think any other stimulus does. In a way, you could almost say that music is a discovery by human beings of some of very fundamental aspects of the way our brain functions. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And you said that discovery by human beings. Do we have examples of, so people share their, videos of their pets rejoicing on, music.
Hmm.
However, and you have songs in birds, for instance, right?
Yes.
So there are precursors to elaborate and complex music in animal kingdom as well, right?
Hmm.
But you don't have those musics, for instance, in dogs. I'm not aware of, or wolves, for instance. Maybe there are, but
As far as we know, right?
right? But at the same time, you see those animals rejoicing with music as well. And not
Yes.
always, but so why is it that, so what is it about? And it's not related to language as well, or is it that
Huh.
that it's unique to humans? Or
Again, one question that's 100 questions rolled into one.
okay,
Let's just start. So it's interesting, you said, and I think most people would say, birds have song,
yeah,
and other animals have other kinds of communication signals that we liken to music. But I mean, that really begs the question, what is music,
mm,
right? And in fact, next week I'll start teaching my music perception and cognition class, and that's class number one. What is really music? Um, so yes, it's a complex, auditory kind of communication, you could say. And it may be that birdsong is related to music, and certainly many of my colleagues believe that, and are looking at birdsong as a way of studying music. So I think it's not only an intuitive thing to think about, but it's also many scientists are taking that approach. But I do think we have to be sort of really careful as scientists when we ask, when we just, say, well, obviously, birds have music, right? I mean, or have song. So we really need to be very careful about what we mean there. And just to sort of tack on and answer another part of your question, there has been in the past 10, 15 years, sort of cottage industry within the scientific community grown up asking about how animals respond to human music. Can animals synchronize to the beat of music? Um, and at first, when people first started, the answer seemed intuitively no. There is no animal that does that. But um, it turns out that vocal learning birds that learn their songs, are actually very good at that.
okay.
Um, and that led to a specific theory. Maybe we can get into this about um, vocal learning apparatus was necessary to be able to do that. And that turns out that is probably not true. So there's something else going on.
Oh, so can we go deeper in this?
Sure.
This is pretty interesting, and I think a central question.
Hmm. So yeah, you know, it was discovered. Actually, I was giving a lecture at Northwestern University, and this was pre-2010, probably, or maybe around the 2010. No, it was pre. I get probably was 2008.
Hmm.
And one of the students in the question session says, "Have you seen this bird called Snowball on YouTube?" And Snowball can be seen really dancing to the Backstreet Boys.
Okay.
It's a really just amazing thing. I would encourage the listeners to go on and just type Snowball dancing in YouTube. Um, Really convincing, like Snowball is having the time of her life, dancing to the Backstreet Boys. Um, I thought that was quite interesting, but one of my colleagues actually thought it was even more interesting, and he went and he studied Snowball. Ani Patel is his name, up at Tufts University, and actually asked the question, is Snowball synchronizing to music? And, it's pretty complicated answer to that question. Snowball is clearly responding to the music, clearly having a response to the rhythm and doing really convincing dance moves, but is not all that well synchronized. So Snowball goes in synchrony and out of synchrony, sort of what we call in the dynamical systems world relative coordination. So she's synchronized for a while, and then is sort of out of sync, and then gets back into sync for a while. Um, so that led Dr. Patel to the hypothesis that vocal learning, uh, that the ability to do this, the ability to synchronize to the beat in music, was a result of having an evolutionary adaptation for vocal learning. So a number of us took that on. I for one was a little bit skeptical, but the first one to really produce strong counter evidence was someone named Peter Cook out at UC Santa Cruz, and he experimented with a seal sea lion named Ronan. And this California sea lion was trained to synchronize to music. Actually, we don't really know so much whether Snowball was trained. Um, Snowball was a rescue animal, and so we don't know so much about whether the owners trained Snowball to do this before Snowball was rescued. But Ronan was definitely trained. And the thing is, we tested Ronan. And I worked with them on some of these studies with Ronan, and what we found was Ronan is as good at synchronizing to the beat of music as the best human beings.
Okay.
So actually, is better at synchronizing than this vocal learning animal, Snowball. So that threw up a bunch of questions in the field, and how could this be? Um, I myself worked with bonobos with my colleague Patricia Gray, worked with bonobos at the Jacksonville Zoo and Gardens. Um, and we were able to see that bonobos, we were drumming with them. So we sat, it was a zoo situation. So they were in a cage, and we were on the other side in the hallway playing drums. And we were able to show that they were able to synchronize with that. That wasn't complex music, was just drumming, but they were able to synchronize. So
I see. Interesting. But you're talking about synchronization, you're talking about movement here, right?
mhm.
And we have not touched the link between movement and music. So was it again, I mean, it resonates, yes, it resonates affective side, but it also resonates with motor control. So again, um where is it all coming from? Like the coordination with music, for instance, most of the dances because with music, right? We do not have many dances without music. uh,
Right.
the steps are coordinated in one fashion or the other, and some people can do it better than others. So
Hmm.
where exact? So what is it again? Again, I'm asking you the same question again. So what exactly is again in the music that leads you to that coordination?
Right. So that is a complicated question. And that's one of the questions I've spent, the past 30 years trying to answer. Um, Before I came into the field, there have been a lot of people who were studying the ability to synchronize to a simple metronome. So the metronome
Yeah,
goes click, 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 and you move your finger, click, 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 and you synchronize.
right.
Um, when I came into the field, I was lucky enough to study with someone named Mari Reese Jones, um, who had this idea that internal rhythms, the rhythms in the brain, the rhythms of the brain, synchronize to the rhythms of music. And I kind of took that idea and ran with it. And I had, some training in math and physics from my undergraduate days. And I created a model, a mathematical model of what might be happening in the brain. So this was, in the early 90s. And this kind of a model is called a nonlinear oscillator. So a nonlinear oscillator, one flavor of nonlinear oscillator is able to generate its own rhythms. Okay.
Yeah,
So, and we know this is what's happening in the brain. So the brain is generating its own rhythms in different frequency ranges. So there's the delta frequency range, which is sort of 1 to 4 cycles per second. That's the frequency at which you hear a beat in music. So if you hear this, so that's the delta frequency range. Then there's the theta frequency range, which is about twice as fast. And then there are other higher frequency ranges. And it turns out, so Mari had this theory that attention was synchronizing to music, or we say it entrains to music. So I had a similar, and I was inspired by the idea of attention, but I was more interested in how do we actually hear the beat?
yeah,
So it's one thing to say click, 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 synchronize, 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 click, click, click. There are a number of different models that can explain how you do that. But when a rhythm is so complicated, like a son clave rhythm in salsa music,
yeah,
how do you get ba, 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 ba? How do you get that out of that complex rhythm? That to me is a super interesting question, and that's beat perception. How do you get a regular beat out of a complex, irregular rhythm?
yeah,
Um, and what I've discovered in those first early years, well, first of all, we worked, Mari and I worked together, and we did articulate a theory which we call dynamic attending theory, which has been investigated by many researchers all over the world for the past 25 years. Turns out dynamic attending theory has a lot of evidence to support it. So it's really seems to be that rhythms of the external world do synchronize attention. But what I was even more interested in is how can you get the beat out of that complex rhythm? And it turns out if you do the math, if you do the physics, if you study the way that nonlinear oscillators synchronize, they can synchronize that steady beat. They can get that steady beat out of that complex rhythm. So it's basically what I would say it's a very fundamental aspect of the way brains work,
right.
which may be the reason that you don't have to have um, a complex circuit for vocal learning in order to hear the beat in complex music. Rather, it's you can learn. Animals can be trained to do this. Any animal could be trained to do this in principle anyway.
Yeah.
So that would be, that would be the alternative theory.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of support for this theory now.
Yes, a number of people have tested this theory. There's a
Yeah.
lot of support in EEG, electroencephalography, a lot of it support from magnetoencephalography, and we continue to test this theory. Um, and I will just add one more thing, which
Yeah.
may blow the conversation open in another way, that I think many different aspects of music perception can be explained in terms of the synchronization of nonlinear oscillations in the brain, not just
Okay.
rhythm.
Okay.
Yeah,
I see. So in a sense, music is a reflection of our own brains.
of our own.
of our own brains, of our own
Yes,
rhythms.
exactly. It's a reflection of our own brains, of the fundamental nature of our own
Right.
brains.
So by that token, is it okay to claim that people's preference for music is basically telling something about the brain or about their internal oscillations? And within the same person, when I like to listen to rock versus, classical piano at different times, is it this the different, you know, resonant states of my brain, which is basically making me like that music at that particular time?
Okay, so liking and preference, these are really complicated. I mean,
Yeah.
now you're sort of really going to the edge of, what I think is possible to explain scientifically. I mean, you can investigate it scientifically, but really explain it, I think it's going to
Yeah.
be some time. However, I do have some ideas about that. So we have this theory, which we call neural resonance theory, and it's a theory of how neural oscillations and other fundamental neural mechanisms may explain the really basic, the basic facts about how we perceive and respond to music. So yes. So um, I think first of all, two things. I think there are. Um, I so I think the way I interpreted your question was. How do are there different types of people who like different types of music? Is that a fair way
Yeah.
to say that kind
Yeah.
of question?
It's a coarser version, yes.
Yeah. So I think, anyone can become attuned to any different style of music. So we really have in neural resonance theory, we think of two things: neural resonance, which is the synchronization of oscillation, and then attunement.
Mhm.
So these oscillations can sort of tune in to different frequencies and different combinations of frequencies. Um, and so you can learn different kinds of music and you can learn to like different kinds of music, I think. Um, and this definitely happens. In different parts of the world, there are very different kinds of music. So
Right.
in Europe versus India versus Africa versus China, very different kinds of music are sort of attuned to by people who grow up in those different cultures. Um, However, I do think that by listening and by attuning to those different kind of music, it in some ways changes the way your brain works. So, and then to the question of whether, on any given occasion you pick music uh, that's going to stimulate those frequencies and that combination of frequencies that your brain is sort of looking for at that time. That's an interesting hypothesis, and I don't know that, certainly we've never asked that in our lab, but it's a very interesting question.
I see. Okay. Then that makes sense. And also, I mean, there's so much of distinction that it's hard to pinpoint. It's like not two or three categories. It's like it's just enormous,
Yes,
and
it's
there's
an
lots of
enormous variety of music around the world. And so, that's one sort of challenge. And um, my colleagues, in this community, that's always the way they challenge me is they say, well, if music is really based on a fundamental brain mechanism like oscillation, well, then how can there be different kinds of music in the world?
right,
And the answer is because your brain just doesn't resonate. The rhythms of the brain resonate to music, but they can also tune to different kinds of stimuli. They can
right,
say, oh, I like that tempo better than this tempo, or I like that complex rhythm better than this complex rhythm. So they can tune in and learn these different things as
right.
well. But what it does predict, actually, which I think is interesting, which is different from a traditional neural network, is that some things about music are going to be harder to learn than others. And I think that's intuitively, obviously true. So if I ask you to do a simple rhythm 2-to-1, and I'd say 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, right? Versus 3-to-2, that 3-to-2 is predicted by our theory that that's going to be harder to learn. And I think if you were to try it right now, I think you'd find the one easy and one harder. And if you can't do the 3-to-2, you could learn to do it. It would just take you a longer time. You see?
Right, right, right,
Yeah.
right. No, that makes sense. So, is there any in that case a developmental window in which our brain is attuned to mostly like other developmental studies? So, given that there's a lot of cultural context, where you grow up and things like that, which shape your preference. Uh, Not so much these days, I would say, because there's a lot more exposure now, especially with digital communication.
Yeah.
But is there any window where it actually shapes our perception of music and abilities of music?
Yeah, so one of my colleagues, Erin Hannon, in her dissertation a number of years ago, tested infants and
Hmm.
showed, and it was known before she started her work that infants uh, display this phenomenon called perceptual narrowing. So if you test an infant on making a distinction between two different speech sounds, um, maybe that occur in some other language, I don't know, Hebrew versus English, even if it's, an American infant at 6 months old, they can make distinctions between all these sounds. So a distinction between two sounds that occurs in Hebrew but does not occur in English, they can distinguish those two sounds just fine. But by the time they reach a year of age, they experience perceptual narrowing. So they lose the ability to distinguish between those two sounds that aren't heard as different in their own native language, in the English language. Okay, so
Okay.
what Aaron showed was that in rhythm, there's the same phenomenon. So there are musics in the world, for example, in Bulgaria, where the pulse of the music, the 1, 2, 3, is not simply isochronous. It's more like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Okay. So at 6 months of age, infants can detect the difference between two different complex meters, but they lose that ability by 1 year of age. And what we were able to show, even in our modeling of these results, is that this process of oscillatory attunement can explain exactly why that happens. Because you're learning the structure of the rhythms that you experience every day.
Yeah.
You're learning to associate those different frequencies in the rhythms that you hear every day. But if you don't hear this other more complex rhythm every day, you will lose the ability to,
Right.
distinguish changes.
Right. Yeah. When you read the book Musicophilia by Oliver Sacks,
Yes, Oliver Sacks. Yeah.
right? So he talks about various cases in which people's perception of music gets distorted, or people just could not listen to music, or on the other extreme they were just a maniac about music and things like that. So
Mhm.
so do you have some thoughts on the relationship between like these diseases and music, or like mental conditions and music? How do they exactly relate?
In terms of your preference to listen to music or
Or in terms of brain disorders,
brain
or
disorders,
given
yeah.
that yeah.
So it turns out that many different neurological disorders
Yeah.
are associated with some form of deficit in rhythm perception or production,
Okay.
and was very surprising to me. I recall walking down the hall in Florida Atlantic University one day, and one of my colleagues called me into her office, and she said, "Ed, have you seen this research that says this dyslexic kids are worse at synchronizing to a musical rhythm?" And I said, "Well, that's strange. I can't think of any reason why that must be. It might be just a coincidence."
Mhm.
And she said, "It's a statistically significant finding, so maybe not a coincidence." And I said, "Yeah, I just can't think of any way that those two things would be related." Well, years later, turns out they are related, and there are many other disorders um, that are associated with deficits in rhythm. So people who are looking at this are people like my former student, Raina Gordon, who's now a tenured professor at Vanderbilt University. She's looking at how music relates to children's ability to process language in general, children's ability to read, and she's doing uh, genome-wide association studies to look at how genes um, for musical and rhythmic abilities specifically are related to language abilities. So I would encourage your readers to go and sort of look at what is happening in that lab at Vanderbilt University. Um, so yes, so Alzheimer's disease is another one. Well, let's go. You said you had Benoit Bardi on earlier. I
Yeah.
didn't hear that podcast. I'll have to go back and listen to that one. But you know, it's been known for quite some time, since the 90s, that rhythmic auditory stimulation is really effective in Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease patients who are unable to initiate a gait, if you turn on a rhythmic music, they will just sort of very naturally be able to synchronize their gait to the music and to walk. Um, and creating a therapy that through which they can use rhythmic auditory stimulation to rehabilitate gait, that turns out to be quite effective as well. Um, Most recently, and this is where Oscillo Biosciences comes in. Um, it's been discovered that in Alzheimer's disease, there is a deficit in synchronization, but not in the frequency bands that we normally associate with music. Well, one of them, yes, I suppose. Uh, but in what's called the gamma frequency band, which is about 40 cycles per second. So that's would be like a very low frequency on the
Yeah.
piano, right? So, so scientists at MIT, Li Wei Tsai and Ed Boyden, discovered that by stimulating um, rat hippocampus directly, stimulating synchronization at that frequency, they were able to actually lower amyloid beta plaque load, which is the protein
Mhm.
that's so problematic in Alzheimer's disease, and improve the mouse's ability to run a maze, so improve their memory. Um, so yeah, so the rhythms of the brain are really
Yeah.
very functional, and somehow these things, these abilities that we consider reading, writing, memory, walking. Well, walking is a little more obviously
Yeah.
related to rhythm, but many of these other abilities that we normally wouldn't think of as being rhythmic are really fundamentally have rhythmic brain mechanisms that enable those things to happen.
So these rhythms are not just emergent, but also important for maintaining the brain states, basically, right? Or even
Exactly
even
right.
at the physiological level, even to maintain
Right.
the physiology.
So the neurons of the hippocampus have to synchronize together
Yeah.
to exchange information and retrieve a memory. That's why that this stimulation is important. So you can almost think of it. So there's a sort of a popular way of thinking about the brain as, the brain is like a computer.
Mhm.
But I would say, I would encourage your readers to think, or your listeners to think, maybe the brain is more like a radio. So the different areas of the brain and the different processes in the brain need to synchronize to exchange information. And that's a very different way to think about what's going
Yeah,
on.
you touched on a very, important and dangerous topic, so we have a new book coming on, especially in this topic. Uh, you know, I think we're too late for a chapter on music, since it's under production, but the book is about the, computation metaphor and its limitations. So you touched on a very important topic, and you have mentioned, traditional neural network multiple times, in
Mhm.
this conversation. Uh, as you said, is it possible to explain musical perception and cognition based on the computational ideas, or where neurons are basically, you know, kind of bits, transferring like information in bits with their spikes, or the so-called, like neural encoding model? Is it even
Mhm.
possible to understand music from them? Or do you know of people who actually use that framework? Or is it that when you are working on music, inherently you drift towards more resonance or more, oscillatory and, dynamical systems approach? You are kind of poised to, take those approaches compared to the strict traditional computational approach.
Right. So, when I was coming up in the field, I mean, the computational approach was very strong, and I even think neural networks are basically a computational kind of approach.
Yeah.
Um, I I certainly I certainly drifted towards these dynamical systems approach. One reason, early in my research in my PhD, I was very interested in what today we would call traditional neural networks.
Hmm.
Of course, in those days, they were not as powerful as they are now. If they were, I probably would have kept on with it and,
Yeah.
never discovered, the relevance of neural oscillation and so forth. But, uh, I think one reason I went towards, dynamical systems was because, uh, I found that the neural networks were not powerful enough to describe what I wanted to describe. Um, Dynamical systems really does seem to be a very different way of thinking about how the brain works.
Hmm.
Again, this is this resonance metaphor or this, radio communication metaphor rather than a computation metaphor. So, um, and now, of course, you can go online and there are all kinds of services, AI services, where you can type in your lyrics and it will write music for you, or it'll write the lyrics too. You just sort of tell it what you want. But what are those systems doing? I mean, fundamentally, they're following a set of rules that they induced from listening to millions and millions of examples of music, right? They've sort of internalized the statistics of music, and there's a sort of a whole branch of the music cognition field that sort of said that's what music is. You just listen to all this stuff
Yeah.
and you
Quite
internalize the
correct.
rules through the statistical regularities, and that's what it is. Um, I think we have some pretty good counter evidence to that, and one is just this thing that I said before. If that were true, then people could internalize any set of statistical regularities, and we would call that music. But music is far more regular than that. There's a wide variety of different musical cultures and styles around the world, but there's also a many substantive similarities between all those musics, whether it's
Hmm.
the rhythm or the pitch or the tonality.
Yeah.
Um, they, musics of different cultures might vary on this, on one particular kind of feature, but on all the others, they have commonalities, So, and the other thing is just that some things are much easier to learn than others. Just take um, much more exposure to learn. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think another thing I would just say about sort of traditional the computer metaphor is that a computer, whether it's operating more traditional, what they call good old-fashioned AI, or a neural network, is that it's following a set of rules to produce an output, and many human musicians do that as well, and that's how
Hmm.
you get the music that you listen to. But real musical creativity, I think it involves sitting down at your keyboard or your guitar, making a new sound and asking how is that sound good? Let
Hmm.
me add this harmony. How does that sound? Does that sound good? And computers definitely don't do that, right?
But AI chauvinists would say that that's reinforcement learning, and we are moving towards reinforcement learning in our neural network models now. So
Oh, but there's no sense in which the computer is listening to the sound that the music makes, right?
uh
So let,
yeah,
let
I
me
mean,
let
yeah.
me give an example. So, we tune our scales to a specific set of pitches. And
Hmm.
actually, that set of pitches is, plus or minus delta, pretty much the same for most musical cultures around the world. There are some exceptions. For example, gamelan music. But if so what I would say is, if this statistical learning kind of approach were true, then it wouldn't really matter how you tune those notes. Any set of 12 different pitches would be equivalent.
Hmm.
But I mean, that seems to me just patently sort of ridiculous. you know. Um, the one there is, and the reason is that I think these pitches are tuned that have this scale that has evolved around the world over thousands of years. The pitches are tuned to ratios of small integers. So 2 to 1, three to
Yeah.
one, just like rhythms. Okay.
Hmm.
Just like rhythms. 2 to 1 is an octave. 3 to 1 is a musical fifth. 4 to 3 is a musical fourth. Um, the science of nonlinear resonance,
Yeah.
this set of techniques we've borrowed from physics, explains why that is,
Right, right, right.
right?
And you see that in movement as well, right? When you look at,
Hmm.
this ratioed coordination between hands and between legs and different parts of the body, there
That's
are
right.
integer ratios which work, there are ratios which do not work.
That's right. That's right. And there is a really a kind of a very, experimental scale that was developed. I don't know, when was it developed? Probably around the 50s, maybe earlier. I'm not even sure. But my colleague, for example, Psyche Louis, who I work on Alzheimer's disease with, she does a lot of experiments with this. It's called the Bolin-Pierce scale. And it's based on the tritive. So it's not an octave or a 2 to 1 relationship, it's a 3 to 1 relationship that's then divided into 13 intervals. And she does get people to learn some syntactic relationships, in these artificially constructed musical pieces that she uses. But um, the Bolin-Pierce scale is actually also an integer ratio scale.
Mhm.
It's just more complex integer ratios. So if you didn't have that, I think it would be much more difficult to learn.
Right. So, so, so in the sense that the science of music kind of lets us understand, what music resonates better than the other, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so do you have are people there who study these music which stick? So, for instance, we have seen several kinds of music or songs which have stuck in the last decades. For instance, Gangnam Style, right? It stuck and got like billions of views on YouTube, and
Hmm.
almost everyone was resonating with that. So there have been trends like that, or Harlem Shake, for instance, in the dance. So are people who have studied these music, like what made them stick? Did they have some quality, some feature which was not there in other kind of music, which does not stick?
So I think there are people studying these called earworms, of course.
Hmm. Okay.
And there are people looking at this from a sort of behavioral point of view.
Mhm.
My particular sort of hypothesis about this, and we haven't done this yet in my lab,
Yeah.
is that these are sort of higher order resonances. So when you look at the way resonance systems operate, um, when you couple the system strongly above a certain limit, it naturally jumps between certain resonant states. And what does that jumping mean? That's like a melody,
Mhm.
right? So, one could think of these sort of earworms, these melodies that get stuck in your head, or these, hyper popular pieces of music as just sort of very natural hyper resonant states in a system that's overcoupled, like the brain.
Right.
Yeah.
So in a way, the science of music can be exploited, by creators.
Hmm. By creators?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it could, I mean, what we do is we try to take a very, hard science kind of physics-based
Yeah.
approach and say, can we sort of understand music from the bottom up? And when you do it that way, I mean, it takes some time, right? I mean,
Right.
uh, so we're making progress. I think, we're able to explain a lot of what's going on out there, but there's a lot more work to do, I think.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
So a little bit about your lab. So what exactly are the kind of experiments which go into the neuroscience of music?
So we've used a number of different techniques. So I think we do things a little bit differently in our lab. So at this
Mhm.
point, um, we try to create hypotheses based on our mathematical models first.
Okay.
Because when you look at these things, one thing I realized is that so when I started building these models, I used at first a very simple model, so it was simple enough for me to understand. And then I said, well, if it's going to explain music, I'm going to have to add this element, I'm going to have to add that element, and so forth and so on. And then I realized one day, as I studied, as I went deeper and deeper, and began to read literature from applied mathematicians who are interested in studying the brain using these tools, I was realizing all these features that I was trying to add by hand as if I were an engineer,
Hmm.
they were already in the biological systems. So these mathematical systems, we study them, we have now, we have mathematical toolboxes that other researchers can use to explore our theories. Um, they do things uh, that are so complicated, it's almost like studying an organism,
Hmm.
right? So first we try to start with the mathematical tools, and we say, what is, the prediction that's made that you wouldn't necessarily have made intuitively. Then we go in and we do behavior. So if we're studying rhythm, we might play a complex rhythm and just ask somebody to tap the beat. Or we might ask them to tap the complex rhythm. That's another kind of thing you can do.
Yeah.
Then once we've understood that, then we'll bring them into the EEG or the MEG, so electroencephalography, magnetoencephalography. These are basically reading either magnetic or electrical fields from outside the brain. So they're very weak signals, but
Yeah.
it can be done. And so we try to ask the question, can we identify a signal in the brain that's correlated with that behavior or that perception in a particular way? Sometimes we use MRI. MRI is not my favorite tool because, first of all, it's very noisy.
Yes.
This banging sound that's going to interfere with the music, but it's got a very slow time scale. So it takes like 6 seconds for that signal that you're reading from the brain
Right.
to relax. So 6 seconds is like a
Lot of time.
lifetime in music, right?
Right. Right.
So, I mean, we do use that sometimes, but what we're doing in our most recent studies is we're doing structural MRI and then very high density EEG in order to try to localize where things are happening in the brain.
Okay.
Okay, so those are the tools that we use. And then, so one example is of a prediction
Hmm.
that I think was counterintuitive at first, is that a complex rhythm might have no physical energy at the frequency that people perceive as the pulse. We call these missing pulse rhythms.
Okay.
Um, so an example of a missing pulse, they don't sound particularly
Yeah.
different. So
Hmm.
Okay. If I ask you to tap the pulse, most people will do this. Bop, 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 bop. Okay. Some people can't do it. It's actually too complicated for some people, but most people will do that. Um, if I were to do what a physicist calls a frequency analysis or a Fourier analysis to ask what frequencies are actually present in that rhythm,
Hmm.
there will be zero energy at the frequency people perceive as a pulse.
That's
Okay.
interesting. Yeah.
So how do people do that, right?
Yeah. Pretty
Well,
contradictory.
yes, so if we use our models
Yeah.
and we run it through a model of neural resonance, it turns out that the oscillator at the frequency of the pulse will gain amplitude. Okay, so
Mhm.
it's at least a plausible explanation. So
Yeah.
then we go into the brain, we do EEG or MEG, and we say, is that frequency present in the brain? And guess what? It is.
Hmm.
So what we're trying to do now is we're trying to do high density EG and structural MRI and ask, where is that happening? Um, and again, sort of in sort of counterpoint to this computational thinking about the brain that very specific parts of the brain have very specific, uh, very specific functions. It does look like there's a lot of variability in where, this perception of the pulse arises in any particular instance. And it has to do with things that you might think were very simple things to change, like a tempo. You change the
Mhm.
tempo a little bit, and the brain areas that are responding can be actually quite different.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not just variable in terms of I mean, it's spatially variable as well.
Spatially variable as well. Exactly.
Yeah. So hard to localize. I mean, that kind of helps, the theme of the podcast.
Beyond phrenology, right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think so I think there are a lot of ways in which the traditional computer metaphor
Hmm.
and the metaphor and the idea that um, specific brain structures have, operate like little machines that have a very specific
Like
job.
modules, yeah.
Yeah, like modules. It's kind of breaking down. Um,
I mean,
Slowly because people really cling to that idea, but it
right.
very, they're all every day there are interesting results that challenge that view.
I mean, I would say yes, it is breaking down, but at the same time, there's this drift where it breaks down, but people come up with some explanations of how they, for instance, a lot of modern network science, which I myself am using, it's it wanted it began to understand the brain as a whole and not basically localize, but
Hmm.
it ends up assigning these nodes and characteristics to the nodes, uh, which basically is somewhere regressive. uh, the whole meta-analysis kind of helps a little bit moving away from localization, but it ends
Hmm.
up bringing you in the same trap when you start assigning these nodes and uh, specific character to these nodes in specific contexts.
Right.
Again, right?
So,
So
but then you change the task a little bit and all the nodes are going to change, probably. This is what I'm
yeah,
saying, at least
exactly.
in
But
music.
then the question is that uh, can we even talk in terms of nodes, or you know, like what exactly is a node? you know, like how do you define a node? It brings back to that question.
Well, I mean, this goes back to one of my colleagues, Eugene Ashikovich, who is a Russian mathematician, been working in this area for, a lot of years. He's American now. I mean, he lives here now, but
Yeah.
originally from Russia. Um, and he has a whole set of papers, and one of them I think is entitled, Does the brain work on FM radio principles? you
Hmm.
know.
Okay.
So is it the case that
Yeah.
two brain areas have to synchronize to exchange information? And then what's that information they're exchanging?
Yeah.
How is that, I don't say representation. I don't use the word representation anymore. I use
Right.
the term embodied.
Mhm.
How is that information embodied in the brain? Because I think, here's another thing about the computer metaphor. In the computer metaphor, there are symbols and representations. And the thing about a symbol is it's abstract,
Right.
right? In our view of music, um, you know, the brain actually embodies resonance relationships. So these embodiments are
Yeah.
physical states of the brain that have lawful relationship to external events like sounds,
Right.
and they're determined by physical principles. So
Yeah.
it's not just abstract representations that are operated on by arbitrary rules that maybe you learn by observing the statistics of thousands and millions and billions of sentences.
Mhm.
But there's some physical principles, I think, that have yet to be discovered,
Yeah. Uh,
that describe how the brain works. And that's not to say that,
yeah.
current neural networks aren't amazing. They are, but I don't think they're working the way the brain is working. And I still think that once we discover what those principles are in the brain, then that's going to
Right.
be.
And it has to be in the physics, right? Because ultimately we're talking about a material acting in certain ways. So we
Mhm.
need to understand how that material basically interacts with its own self, or material within that material. You know,
Mhm.
this part versus that part.
Yeah.
That
So, and the
yeah.
the other thing I think in terms of embodiment is if, you know, it's because the brain is embodying these rhythmic signals
Hmm.
that we're able to do things like treat Parkinson's disease and treat Alzheimer's disease
Yeah.
with music and sound and synchronized light, like we do at Oscillo Biosciences.
Right. Right. I agree with
So,
you. I think it was during my high school years that, I used to think a little bit about brain. And that's when I realized that and this I was thinking in terms of the national anthem, so Indian national anthem, which we had to sing, at every now and then event, in school. So I would try to come up with like a fifth stanza or third sentence of the fifth stanza. And there's no way I could come up with that, right?
You have to go in order.
You have to go in order. But once you give me like the first, or I'll forget something, right? But even for that stanza, if you give me the first word or a first phrase, then I can recite all of it, right? And the
Hmm.
same is with songs. Like there's no way I even know if you ask me like 10 words, do these 10 words are there in that song in the song? I cannot recall or I cannot recognize. But at the same time, if you give me that first two or first line, then suddenly we recite the whole songs
Yeah,
as
yeah,
if we are creating the whole song rather than actually having a representation of that whole song,
exactly.
right?
Same thing for me. I mean, if you ask me, what comes first, L or P,
Hmm.
I have to go through the alphabet, I have to recite it to find that out. I don't just,
Right.
that's
But
not an
but but
abstract fact in my brain.
but at the same time, now when we are in the era of LLMs with short range correlations, working in LLMs, it kind of challenges. So we make this claim that LLMs work in a different way than brains, and I agree with that. But at the same time, there is some commonality there because LLMs are also creating, they need something to go somewhere rather than bringing it something from somewhere.
Hmm.
So
I wouldn't say there's no relationship. I just think
yeah,
that, I think this idea of abstract representations is really the shortcoming, right?
yes,
This
yes,
this idea um, of sequence processing and expectation, I think those things are true.
right,
But I think expectation comes from resonance. It's not, it's just an abstract,
yeah.
statistical.
It is coming out of some physics rather than coming out of some abstract rules.
Yes.
Or okay, okay. And just one trace left on this. Like, do you really think that we have? So, is there any concept like prediction error in music? So, for instance, a lot of theories in motor control, movement sciences talk about prediction control, where you have prediction, but you're trying to match the prediction with actually consequence, and then you have an error signal which you use
Hmm.
to correct your next step. There's a what should I say? A profound assumption there that we do things in our brain has like a timestamp or step-by-step fashion when it knows when exactly the error arriving, what exactly the error corresponds to. It comes with a lot of baggage.
Hmm.
Do we have certain concepts like an error correction or reference copy in music perception? Or
So yeah, so actually we're just about to publish a paper in Nature Neuroscience. It's accepted in principle, so I hope
congrats,
it will
yeah,
be out there in a month or two.
yeah.
It's called musical neurodynamics, and we attack exactly this question. So there's a popular theory in music, a newer theory than ours, that's come along in music cognition world that
Hmm.
challenges the neural resonance theory, and it is exactly this theory. It's called predictive coding in music theory.
Oh,
So
predictive coding is like, oh man, I mean, you might not agree with that, but I feel that predictive coding has become like a plague, which is something which has no head or tail, but you can insert it anywhere and
yeah.
it is spreading like a virus.
Well, I don't know if I'm gonna go quite that far, but
Yeah,
what we really say is that, one of the and even the predictive coding and music people, they will
yeah,
say, well, we think neural oscillation is a mechanism of prediction.
yeah, right, right, right.
And because our theory has been out there for longer, and it's known that,
Yeah.
these neural oscillations are helping you to know when to expect events in music or in speech, for example.
Mhm.
But what we say is that neural or expectation is really just one consequence of neural resonance,
Right, right.
whole set of others. So this whole thing about, integer ratios being relevant to both rhythm and pitch and tonality,
Hmm.
um, it makes a whole set of predictions about why the structures of music, why those common structures of music are found across the world.
Yes.
Otherwise, why wouldn't, why wouldn't the music of, I don't know, let's say Japan
Yeah.
use a completely different set of pitches and a completely different kind of rhythmic structure than the music of Europe, right? But they don't. They use similar pitches, they use similar rhythmic structures, very different culturally and so forth, absolutely. But
Right.
there are very fundamental aspects that are also in common. So, and the neural resonance actually predicts all those things
Right.
and expectation as well.
And also it's falsifiable because prediction, the biggest problem with prediction or predictive coding framework is it's not false. It can almost explain everything. So
Right,
there's no boundaries to
right.
expectations there.
And
Yeah.
and according to my reading, it predicts that anything you see out there in the world that has a statistical regularity can be learned as easily as any other thing. But in music, if you just try to learn to play the drums, you know that's not true.
Right. Right.
There are certain things you can do that are easy, and there are certain things that are
There's a
hard.
reason why we have, why we go for, sh I mean, why we have these musical celebrities, there's a reason, why
Mhm.
we still, talk about Beethoven and Mozart
That's
and
right.
others, right?
That's right. And
Yeah.
and there's a reason why, most people, listen to music that's got three or four chords and very simple harmonies, and
Yeah.
because it's easy to listen to and it speaks to us,
Hmm.
and people might say, oh, well, that's simple music. It's not really great music, but I totally disagree. I mean, I think all you need for great music is three chords,
Hmm.
and if you can't do it with three chords, having more chords in your vocabulary is not going to help,
Oh, I like
you
some of the worst songs ever. So so I agree with you. I it's you can be snob about musical taste, but I mean people's taste is, I mean, we own our tastes.
Right,
So
that's right.
right.
But so you
Okay.
haven't asked me about Oscillo Biosciences yet.
I will. So
Okay,
I think that's where we should spend most time on actually.
okay,
Because okay, let's do that. Before I move to a couple of other questions.
sure.
So yeah, so we have covered something like this, as you mentioned in Parkinson's. When I interviewed Bernard Birdie, and his company is basically focused on beats. Yours is more elaborate and specifically using music for Alzheimer's, right?
That's right.
So yeah, please go ahead and it would be lovely to hear, especially like which phase of application you are right now, and what kind of
Mhm.
success you have with it.
Sure. So I'll sort of tell you the story, the origin story
Yeah.
of what we're doing now. So um,
And may I interrupt you
yeah.
for a second? This is also important for audience, especially young graduate students, because we can make a company anytime, but at the same time, when you have done the science and you have understood the principles, it's a very different way of thinking about a solution to a health issue or any other thing, where it is coming out of our principles which you have yourself established. So that's the
Mhm.
beauty of your particular company.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, thank you. I So this uh, approach to Alzheimer's really it came out of a couple of different directions. One is
Mhm.
music therapy,
Mhm.
and music therapy is um, it's a field that I was not, super comfortable with early on. I thought, I'm doing hard science. These guys are just playing
Yeah.
music for sick people. They don't really know what they're doing. And
Right.
I met Dr. Connie Tomeno early in the 2000s, and she came down to visit our university in Florida and asked me to be on their scientific advisory board, which I was kind of surprised by. And I was a little skeptical, but she invited me to come up to the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function, which she founded with Oliver Sacks, by the way.
Oh, nice. Good history
Yeah,
there.
and she
Yeah.
said, "Why don't you just come up and see what we do if you're so
Hmm.
skeptical?" And I went up there, and I, among other things, participated in a drum circle with aphasic patients, so patients who had suffered stroke or maybe survived a gunshot wound to the head. Um, and these patients, some of them could barely walk into the room. Some of them were in wheelchairs,
Hmm.
and they participated in this. And well, when they first sat down, there was a pall over the room. I mean, the depression was, you could almost feel it. You could feel it in the air. You're breathing it in. And after a 45-minute drum circle, the whole room was completely different.
Hmm.
Everyone was feeling this positive vibe, if you want to call it that. And I realized at that time that even if that's all music does, if it
Yeah.
just helps you not be depressed because of your, what for these patients was a dire situation, that's got to have positive consequences. So, I started, becoming involved with Connie and the work she was doing, and then went on to do other things with this company that I, went through a number of different iterations. And in about 2019, my colleague Psyche Louie from Northeastern University, so Dr. Ji Chul Kim, my long-term colleague here at University of Connecticut, and I had founded Oscillo in 2016, and we were originally doing something different. It was just entertainment, lighting,
Yeah.
and we were just having some fun with it. And Psyche Louie came to us in 2019, and she said, "Did you see this research from MIT?" where they're stimulating the brain of Alzheimer's mice called
Yeah.
5X FAD mice
Hmm.
um, at 40 hertz and really affecting, reversing, some of the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And, she said, and I mean, I'll play you, maybe this will work. I hope it will.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I just want your audience to hear what a 40 hertz auditory stimulus sounds like. Okay. Oh, yeah. Can you hear it?
No.
You can. Oh, darn. It is because I don't know. It's probably my sound. Let me just see. Well, I'll make the sound for you. It sounds
Okay.
like that.
Okay.
So their
Yeah.
therapy for, that they invented, they created a company, um, is to listen to that sound and watch lights flicker at that frequency to try to
Hmm.
stimulate that
Hmm.
frequency in your brain. Dr. Louis said to me, I bet, given what you have discovered about neural entrainment,
Hmm.
and given, what my research in music therapy
Yeah.
and et cetera, she said, I bet take we could develop we could essentially take a light stimulus
Hmm.
that's synchronized to the music, add 40 hertz, and we would have a effective therapy for Alzheimer's disease. So what our
Okay.
therapy is you
Yeah.
listen to your favorite music, you select it yourself.
Yeah.
We have an algorithm based on our dynamical systems that synchronizes lights to that music. Okay.
Okay.
And this delta band, which is the beat, and the theta band, which is a little bit faster.
Yeah.
And then there is also a 40 hertz component, or a higher frequency component. We actually don't use 40 hertz, but a
Yeah.
higher frequency component. And that light is synchronized to the music in such a way to stimulate 40 hertz activity in the brain.
Okay.
And more than that, what's called phase amplitude coupling. So
Hmm.
theta gamma phase amplitude coupling that we're trying to stimulate. And at first I said, Psyche, this is too good to be true. This couldn't possibly work. But
Right.
I respect her enough as a scientist that I
Hmm.
actually went and built it, or had, one of my interns build it. And she started experimenting with it and getting positive results. So it was really amazing.
Hmm.
Now we're in a phase 1 clinical trial, and with almost 30 patients complete out of 60, we are actually improving memory in the patients who are getting the music-based therapy versus patients who are listening to a podcast, sorry,
Yeah.
and also watching lights.
It's beautiful. It's
And so
beautiful.
we're improving their memory, and
Yeah.
also in the ADAS cog 14, which excuse me, which is a battery of 14 cognitive tests.
Hmm.
That's sort of the gold standard for assessing, how your
Yeah.
Alzheimer's is progressing. Um, the control group is actually getting significantly worse in their cognitive function,
Which you would
whereas,
assume, yeah, over time.
whereas
Yes.
our group is getting a little bit better.
Hmm.
So in terms of, our behavioral measures, we're
Yeah.
already getting significant results in everyone.
And do you have plans to, get more physiological measures out of these patients as well?
Oh yes, I mean we're taking blood draws
Yeah. Okay.
to measure their amyloid beta plaque load.
Hmm.
We are doing structural MRI, functional MRI, EEG.
Yeah.
So we're doing everything. It's the behavioral results are they're the most important because that's
Right.
where the
Ultimately, that's what we
drugs.
are interested in to improve.
That's right.
Yes.
That's where the drugs fall down. They've got just
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
marginal results in behavior.
I mean, this is the case with a lot of drugs, right? They improve, whatever we think they should improve rather than improving the
Mhm.
functionality of like people's, everyday kind of life.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
And
right.
this is also beautiful because it speaks to the whole concept of nonlinear causality, which is kind of the bedrock of our work, where we cannot localize the cause, but the cause is coming out of the whole basically system
Exactly. It's a
functioning,
systems neuroscience approach, really.
right?
That's right.
So it's kind of a beautiful example of that in terms of therapy.
Yeah, I think so. And, right now we're out there, we're raising money to
Hmm.
do a phase 2 clinical trial, which will be much bigger. And, our goal is to get FDA approval,
Yeah.
um, so that your physician can,
Hmm.
write you a prescription for our therapy. Um,
Right.
so, so we're sort of right in the thick of it right now. And we're having some early success with our, with
If you think deeply about, these concepts, so I mean, so for instance, when we live, in an outdoor environment, the kind of stimulation we get, the kind of oscillations we get through light, through reflections, through water, the sound of water, for instance, are very different compared to when we are indoors. We have this fan and, air conditioning unit and the refrigerating making white noises, a lot, very devoid of that frequency spectrum in general.
Mhm.
As well as visual stimulation is also, this artificial paint basically is just one chemical coating compared to
Yes,
when you look at the trees, outside, which have the whole spectrum of green color rather than just one, one particular kind of green.
that's right.
So, right. So,
That's really very interesting. I mean, you know, it's an interesting question to what extent, this manufactured environment that
yeah,
we have put ourselves in, and we've imprisoned ourselves in, may be responsible for some of the, for some level of cognitive decline.
yeah,
Uh, we usually in this Alzheimer's, game, we usually say, well, people are living longer, so it's natural that they would experience cognitive decline. That would be more common, but and then um, if you look at the numbers around the world, in outside the United States and Europe, um, you see lower numbers for cognitive decline.
yeah,
But that's usually explained away by saying, well, in these cultures, people just, think of, people just naturally, this is just a natural part of aging, so they don't think of it necessarily as a neurological disorder. But, it may be that people who are, more, focused, or have more of a natural environment experience less.
yeah.
That's, I think, something that
Also,
remains to be
also,
seen. I'm just speculating now, of course,
yeah,
right?
also, like for instance, having grandkids, living with yourself, when you're old is a very different. I mean, now we have so many studies showing that how it increases longevity and, reduces cognitive decline.
Yeah,
So there are a
yes.
number of factors which we have ignored in modern lifestyle in general. I mean, out of necessity or out of the structure.
And just out of the structures we created for ourselves in the way,
Yeah,
yes, the family moves away and,
yeah,
you find yourself alone or, alone with your spouse in a manufactured environment, or maybe you move out of the house you've lived into for a very long time and you move to Florida.
right,
And then
right,
all of a sudden there's nothing around to remind you
yes,
of your previous life, right?
right.
And
Also the concept of retirement at a particular age rather than retirement. So we have attached retirement to the age rather than to actually cognitive state.
yes. Oh,
Right.
that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have a test for when you should retire.
I mean, from the ecological standpoint, when we're talking about organism environment coupling and, these kind of links, it makes more sense. Like, for instance, I wish New Year on people's birthday because that's their New Year on Earth rather
Hmm.
than having like 1st of January because I mean, who cares about 1st of January? It's
That's
just,
very arbitrary, isn't it?
right, it is arbitrary.
Yeah,
So it has to be relative to organisms.
That's right. That's right.
So that's wonderful news on the front of Alzheimer's with your company. Are there other companies like that, or are you aware of other treatments going on right now or trials going on right now related to music?
Well, specifically in Alzheimer's,
Yeah.
there is the cognito approach, which is just that sort of 40 hertz buzzing and light,
Hmm.
um, which I think, to me, it seems likely that there are going to be problems with compliance. People are not going to like doing that as much as they like with music.
Hmm.
I do know of a trial that's going on in Toronto, where they're essentially doing something very similar to what Oscillo is doing, but it's just music, not the synchronized light.
I see.
And they are actually getting some pretty good results. I was pretty impressed with that. So, it's not just the synchronized light, it's the music is a very important part of the therapy because music itself, and I didn't even say this, but when you talk about resonance, what happens when you listen to a rhythm is you get delta, at say 2 hertz, and theta at 4 hertz, but those are phase amplitude coupled to bursts of gamma frequency oscillations. So that music is intrinsically activating gamma frequencies. What
Mhm.
we try to do with the light at Oscillo is then synchronize those intrinsic gamma frequencies. That's sort of our, the fundamental thinking behind our approach.
Yeah.
But just music. I mean, there's a beautiful uh, documentary from the Institute for Music, or who is it from? Is it Institute for Music and Neurological Therapy? I don't know. I don't want to say it wrong, but it's called Alive Inside, and it's got Connie Tomeno and Oliver Sacks is in it. It was made before Oliver passed
Mhm.
away. And they show, just this amazing effect that music has on Alzheimer's patients. You know, um, so I would encourage people to watch that documentary. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's nice. That's great information. I'll actually, by the way, post all these links on YouTube. So once I, process the video, so a lot
Oh,
of
cool.
about your work and a lot of things you have mentioned, the
I'll
the
send
links
you
would
the
actually
links.
go in. Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
So on the flip side of this whole coin of music and its good effects, and good music, let's talk about bad music. So why do we? I mean, we do know what like some music is bad, some music is just unbearable, right? It's torture. And we have, for instance, Chinese torture a mechanism to actually torture, prisoners, for instance.
Mhm.
So, what is it about the bad music that it is bad, and why is it harsh? Like, why is it discomforting? What does it do?
Well, yeah, that's a really tough question because there's so much, personal choice,
Yeah,
headbanging rock and roll you know, might be wonderful for, some people, but, you could probably torture me with it, if you played it for long enough.
yeah.
Um,
But there can be
so
some music which is bad for like almost everyone will say that's bad or that's harsh or that's like
I
torture.
used to have a bunch of examples. My colleague Justin London at
Hmm.
the Carleton College, he's a music professor there. He's actually does a lecture on like the worst music in the world, and I haven't seen it. It's been a while since I talked to him about this, so I can't remember exactly what's on that. But there,
Okay,
we could make a link to his talk or something too.
okay.
Um, but I think for many people, just something that's very, very repetitive and it doesn't stop.
Hmm.
I mean, I think that really drives some people nuts.
Right.
Right? Something that's very harsh sounding tones, like like heavy, heavy metal.
And our fire alarms are like made for that, for instance, Yeah.
What is made for that?
Our fire alarms,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
um, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think just stuff that's too repetitive, stuff that's too harsh, maybe.
But why is it
Um,
hard for the brain? Like, I mean, from the brain's perspective, from the neural oscillator's perspective, like, why is
yeah,
it unbearable?
I don't know. I don't know. The other thing that comes to mind is like elevator music, because that sort of they suck all the emotion out of it and just, try to make it a calming experience,
Hmm.
right? That for some people is really difficult. Um, but maybe, it is. it is music that's incompatible with our emotional state, or because music really does just fundamentally and just naturally, for whatever reason, touch, our emotions, and really can manipulate our emotions even. And
Uh,
so if that's really incompatible.
so what I'm trying to get at is that do we have some physics of interference there, or do we have some physical models which can explain? For instance, uh, are there models to disrupt harmonics in a neural oscillator?
Oh, I see what you're getting at. So yeah, I mean, I don't think though there certainly are. Um,
Okay.
I don't think those maybe explain the everyday experience of bad music,
Yeah.
right? But certainly, for example, if you were to take music and you were to reorganize it along the frequency spectrum, so to make it non-harmonic, it sounds really horrible.
Hmm.
So, yeah, and that can be certainly explained with the sort of resonance theory.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so we haven't really we're now worried about what makes music sound good, but we haven't delved into what makes music sound bad yet.
Right.
Yeah,
That makes sense. Okay, so one of the important questions we haven't touched is, I mean, and we have talked, quite a bit about in reference to is the emotional state. So you just said that
yeah.
so emotional states or hormonal states or getting goosebumps, for instance. So uh, are you aware of work relating those two? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, I mean, I think there's sort of in terms of emotions, just in general, there are kind
Hmm.
of two basic approaches. The you know two fundamental ways of thinking about it in my take. One is sort of this basic emotion point of view.
Hmm.
And the basic emotion point of view says, there are four or five basic emotions. There's, happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust. That those are five that that you read in a lot of and that these are sort of hardwired, and you can read them in the faces of people, so that cross-culturally, I could tell, I could meet someone from China who's never been to, the West, and, I've never been to China, and I can tell whether they're happy, sad, angry, fearful, or disgusted.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it's like hardwired into us, it shows on our face. And then there's this other theory called psychological constructionism, which says that really uh, that emotion is constructed from more basic physiological mechanisms. And they talk about, arousal, how exciting is something, or
Hmm.
a valence, and sort of a good versus bad continuum. And once you combine those things with sort of an appraisal of what's happening in,
Yeah.
in the real world that's causing this situation, that's where emotion comes from. So it's really not cross-cultural. And I would say that I subscribe to the latter view.
Hmm.
And I think that this dynamical approach, it is really strong in terms of describing what's going to be, of describing, these two dimensions of valence and arousal or excitement,
Right.
uh,
Right.
to which you could add tension actually in music. So there's a tension relaxation sort of idea
Hmm.
in music, which I think could be a legitimate sort of third dimension there.
Yeah.
Um, I would go to, this sort of idea in Western music. I think probably all your readers will be familiar with this idea that major is happy and minor is sad. So the major third is happy and the minor third is sad. Oh, sorry. Daughter calling me. Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Call her back later. Um, major is happy, minor is sad, right?
Hmm.
I used to think that was the most, uh, just a coincidence, right? You,
Hmm.
you learn that major is happy and minor is sad, because why would that be? Otherwise, it's just two different intervals. Um, but if you think about it from an dynamical systems point of view, a major third is a 5 to 4, and a minor third is oh, sorry, what is it? 6 to 5.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry,
So,
I'm illiterate when it comes to notes.
okay.
So
So it's
yeah.
it's a more stable ratio,
Hmm.
basically. And
Hmm.
there are other all, you can work out the mathematics much more
Yeah.
complicated than that. But but this idea, what's occurred to me lately, and we do touch on this in our new paper, musical neurodynamics, which is coming out in Nature Neuroscience, um, that major and minor might not be just learned.
Hmm.
Okay. It may be that there is some resonance relationships that underlie our perception of emotion in music. And this would explain why you can go to study, a tribe in Africa that's had minimal exposure to Western music, and they can tell happy versus sad, classical music.
Hmm.
Or you can play Americans Indian raga,
Hmm.
and they can identify the emotion that raga is supposed to evoke. I mean, it's not 100%, but it's well above chance.
Yeah.
So these ideas that major is happy, minor is sad, or this much more complicated emotional sort of descriptions of that you find in Indian music
Yeah.
um, may really actually have a physical basis. I mean,
Hmm.
and it would be part attunement, part you have to be attuned to the music of that culture, but also part, really just very basic, physical resonances.
Right. That makes sense. That makes complete sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you touched upon the third dimension of music, which is relaxation, right?
Hmm.
So now you have, for instance, pink noise, right? Or we have like special YouTube, libraries with pink noise of, water falling and, multifractal noises or multi-scale, basically multi-frequency spectrums of different, natural events, natural processes, which make you feel sleep or relax. A lot of these elements are there also in cafe music or some kind of jazz as well. And then you have on the other side ASMR, right, which is basically autonomous sensory mediation responses now.
Hmm.
And I myself have felt, like you just play some ASMR and I instantly, fell asleep. Fall asleep. So generally speaking, so 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 you have these two different kind of stimulus. One is basically a harmonic, with a declining frequency band, and the other one is basically random noises from random objects, which when I don't want to sleep, it can be annoying. But when
Hmm.
I want to sleep, that suddenly that ASMR actually it claims to create tingling sensations and make you sleep. It works in some people, it doesn't work. So, do you have any thoughts on ASMR, or is it just a
ASMR isn't particularly something that I have delved into, so I
yeah,
don't really have anything, smart to say about that.
okay,
Um, I do think these ideas of pink noise and so forth,
yeah,
being related to nature sounds really goes
hmm,
back to your previous
yeah,
comment about, the constructed environment that we live in. I mean, you mentioned visual examples, but you could also talk about the sounds of the natural world versus the sounds we surround ourselves with. And I think there is, good reason to suspect why those kinds of sounds
hmm.
would have a calming effect or a relaxing effect.
Okay. Then one of the questions which I never found somebody to actually ask, and I didn't trust, Google to answer, was the digital and analog divide. So when I'm listening to a person in physical neighborhood, or somebody actually playing a sitar or a violin, compared to when I'm actually playing that from a digital file, and no matter the quality of a musical instrument, how expensive it is or how good it is, do you think it's the same thing, or there's always a information loss whenever we record and transmit or store things in electronic forms?
Well, there's definitely information loss. The question is it information loss that you can hear? Right.
Yes. Or the information loss which I may not be able to perceive consciously and tell, but definitely it is information loss based on the spectrum or bands in which the brain actually works.
Right. That's right. So, I mean, theoretically, as
Yeah.
far as everything we know, as long as you don't use some compression scheme that's actually throwing away information in audible, frequency range,
Yeah.
um, and you sample at a high enough rate, um, you shouldn't be able to hear the difference between, a digital recording and an analog recording. Um, Nevertheless, people do seem to be able to hear the difference. I can certainly tell the difference if I'm listening to an LP versus an MP3. Well, MP3 is not a good example, but a WAV file, let's say, you know. Um, but where does that difference come from? I mean, I think, some of that warmth and that feeling that people get in listening to an LP is not the um, might not be actually the music per se, but
Okay.
the other sounds that
The
are being created by that analog device, which recording engineers try to get rid of on purpose, right?
mhm.
So yeah,
Okay, that explains.
yeah.
Okay, so Professor Raj, that was a lot of discussions. Do you think we have missed on some important core issues related to music, which you would
Um,
also like to throw in?
no, I think we've done a pretty good job. I think, I just would love for your readers to take away this idea of resonance and attunement, and
Mhm.
the idea that the brain is sort of the basic properties of the brain, the basic dynamical properties of the brain are inherently music, and that's,
Right.
inherently musical, and that's, why music is so powerful. I think the idea that, because the brain, it responds to music in this embodied way. We think of
Mm.
embodiment as being our limbs and our
Right.
torso, whatever, but the brain is part of the body too, and it obeys physical laws. So I think that's the reason, the embodiment is the reason that music is effective in as a therapy.
Mhm.
So I think these are really the most important things. And then, just a word to students and people just entering the scientific field, to say that, music really, we're starting to understand a lot about it. We're starting to understand enough that we can develop effective therapies for, really what seem to be intractable neurological problems, but there are still many, many basic issues to be worked out, and
And
many,
yeah,
many applications to be worked out.
right.
Um, so, it's a great time to be
Right.
coming into this field and learning about all this stuff.
And funding agencies are actually recognizing it, and NIH has a special call for now music-related therapies, and it's kind of growing.
Oh, it is
So
growing, yes. And
yeah,
so, yeah, so NIH is funding this, and that's part of this explosion is that NIH has realized that music can have a significant impact on health. Um, and that's one of the reasons. I mean, they're funding our research at Oscillo Biosciences. They're funding our phase 1 clinical trial and continuing development of this therapy. So yeah.
it's wonderful. And for people who are not planning to pursue science but are just interested in the topic, do you have some, easy resource for them,
So I
to
think,
start?
yeah, I mean, I think I would recommend this Musicophilia book that you mentioned by Oliver
Yeah.
Sacks. Really great read. He's a wonderful writer. Um, there are a number of books out there. Most recently published, Dan Levitin published a book called "I Heard There Was a Secret Chord," um, and this is about music and music therapy.
Hmm.
So he's written a number of books about music cognition, which are great for there's not non-scientific audience. Um, and I can think about some others out there. We can maybe put some more links to from your website.
Definitely.
Yeah,
So, thank you, Professor Laj, for your appearance today. It was a wonderful conversation. I myself learned a lot from this, and
yeah, I enjoyed talking to you too.
hopefully we'll meet again and discuss some of the issues in much greater detail, from a scientific standpoint.
Happy to.
So, thank you so much, and have a nice day ahead.
All right, you too.